Welcome to this Canadian Patriot broadcast, where once again I am joined by my good friend Anton Chaitkin, who I would label Anton as probably one of the three most influential living people who have really helped me make sense and develop a method of historical research. So people have given us really good feedback over the last few sessions that we've done, the emergency broadcast that we've posted over the last year. So I'm really happy that Anton called me up, gave me a quick update, had some thoughts to share, especially regarding today's strategic situation. Trump and Putin announced that they will likely be meeting in Saudi Arabia next week, as far as I could tell. There's a vastly influential discussion happening right now that's forcing itself upon a lot of placent technocrats who have been too used to just moving along, going along to get along with the script of the New World Order, who now have to deal with the reality of protectionism, the assertion of national sovereignty playing an active role in global systems and foreign policy. So very interesting stuff. Again, protectionism being one of the characteristics of the American system, not all, but an important part of it. So Anton is somebody who has just distinguished himself as one of the leading experts on the American system and this deeper history, which we are seeing potentially being revived in front of our eyes. Potentially, not to say that there aren't disruptive negative influences that could turn this inside out, but despite that, there's some really good momentum going on. So Anton, thank you for joining me today. And I know you have some thoughts regarding your analysis of where America is at. There's a lot of cynical and a lot of optimistic views, and I know you tend to be pretty good at nuance. So where do you see the U.S. currently at this stage of the crisis under Trump and the orientation that he's putting forth domestically in foreign policy?
One of the outstanding features of this administration is that many of its top people are interested in what they refer to as the American system of economics. In their view, it's the 19th century economic nationalism of Hamilton, Henry Clay, and Lincoln on through McKinley. And this involves, and this is something that has people who want to understand the possibilities of this period have to understand the truth about this new potential massive shift in the world, because the discussion of the American system, which you and I and people associated with LaRouche earlier, the book by Salisbury, Alan Salisbury, and Nancy Spanis's work, and my work over a long period, this has had fruition now that and people are looking up this history. I've written a definitive history. I want to get into something that's necessary from that in a minute. But you have to see this discussion, which has been suppressed, the whole discussion of the prior economic policy of the country and how it came about, the battles for it, was suppressed for decades in the middle, really the middle and even early 20th century, and then into our period, seriously suppressed in the last several decades. So this is now, there is a possibility for a new national discussion, and that's what we really have to encourage. I'll mention the name of Robert E. Lighthizer, Lighthizer. He was the trade representative for President Trump in the first Trump administration. And he wrote a book about the tariffs and his work. I don't remember the name of it right at the moment. I have it. I don't remember the name, but he gave a speech um, in 2022 to the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, Buckley's old organization, and he was telling the conservatives there they have to give up their religion of free trade, and it's contrary to their principles. So they were not really applauding what he was saying. A lot of them agreed with him, but a lot of them didn't. And clearly, this is the transatlantic establishment. The Democratic Party has played the villain on these things about industrial policy and so forth, but it obviously doesn't come from any party. It's the establishment that has discouraged industry throughout the world and has ruined and taken down American industry. So here's my hypothesis to start this conversation. Assuming that this goes as planned, which is that the plan is to revive American manufacturing. That's the main emphasis. Using tariffs and other means to do that. With that emphasis, which is a wrenching away from previous policy, the United States and its people will have a different perspective on the world.
Yeah.
Which even those planning these things have not didn't think about necessarily, although some of them have thought about it. So that's my hypothesis. Many things that have not been possible, relationships with China, with Africa, with other places, even Latin America, and other aspects of world affairs and domestic affairs, not related directly to trade, are going to change if we can be restored as a productive manufacturing country. That's a huge change in the world. So that's to start the conversation.
Yeah, that's good. And it's definitely that's clearly indisputable that there is a change in paradigm, a change in strategic thinking, which has decided that the post-industrial neoliberal order of effectively nation stripping and empire is not going to work. It's just not going to work anymore. So that has to be thrown out the window, and a retooling of our thinking has to be put in. My question is always like, what's the deeper motive behind it? And from your standpoint, when it comes to the danger of war, since those nations, especially China and Russia, but the other nations that have been given strength by virtue of them being able to stand on their own 2 feet and defend the industrial scientific traditions of humanity. There's a larger array of nations that have been given strength to work with that dynamic of the multipolar alliance. Do you see that this Trump USA is oriented towards peaceful cooperation with that dynamic, or are you seeing evidence of geopolitical, like, will they use their intention to use this retooled productive power that could hopefully be rebuilt in order to challenge and fight Russia and China? Or do you see do you see hope of a more diplomatic, common sense harmonization of interests with those nations?
Well, as you know, and as you have written, the government and any administration, and even any political party, is not one thing. There's an entrenched set of players beyond the government. People talk about the deep state. They may have in mind just the government, but a whole array of people who are governing our society, who are trying to hold on to power and hold on to this neoliberal system and the transatlantic system of deindustrialization and dehumanization of the world. So just if you look in depth here, I mentioned Lighthizer. J.D. Vance is associated with this. There's a couple of institutes. One is called the America First Institute. There's the American Compass website. There's some other groups like this, and the Secretary of Agriculture and some other leading officials in this present Trump administration have this same viewpoint: restoring American manufacturing with an emphasis on the needs of American workers, and the trade policy should be geared towards solving their problems. They also bring up the fact that when you have productive industry and the nation is productive, and that means skilled and productive industrial jobs, then you have the possibility of having families and having successful communities. If you look at it from the other side, we have national suicide going on. We have 100,000 deaths a year from drug overdose. And when you address industrial policy, even if you are bashing China or bashing anything else, you are addressing some reality. For example, the discussion with China about fentanyl. I don't know how much of that is true. I don't know how much of that is justified. It's clearly China bashing, because they're not talking in a respectful tone when they do that. Many of them. However, on the other side, Trump, I think it was a couple of days ago, said we've got to I'm going to talk to China and Russia about stopping the arms race with nuclear weapons. Why blow up the world 50 or 100 times over and then develop new nuclear weapons to do it more? That's crazy. We should cut our defense budgets by 50%. Yeah. It sent the defense stocks plummeting. And he wanted to have those discussions after bringing peace to the Middle East. But even with bashing China on fentanyl, supposedly China produces this chemical that's used to produce the terrible opioids in the U.S. Nevertheless, it's a real crisis. It's a real problem. And so if you're addressing this problem, how are you going to solve this problem? You're going to solve this by industrializing the United States. That's how you solve it. What's wrong with Ohio? They don't have industry. They had the greatest industry in the world. People are committing suicide one way or the other because of this change, this terrible renunciation of mankind that happened in recent decades under U.S. misleadership, being led by people who hate the United States and what it stands for in recent decades. So I was looking at Africa recently. Trump and Elon Musk are supposedly putting a wrecking ball to various agencies of the country. Their rhetoric has to do usually the same way that Rand Paul does, where he gives an award to the silliest kinds of government spending each year. So that's how they justified closing down USAID. I didn't see a discussion of USAID's malicious role in overthrowing governments, which they do with National Endowment for Democracy and other agencies. A friend of mine pointed out that USAID does some good. They provide some aid in certain projects. Well, I looked it up, and I'm not convinced that they do any good. I'm not convinced that any of the aid in recent decades that goes through USAID is useful, and probably a large part of it is harmful. If you, I saw a write-up of their electricity aid, for example, their projects. They're using almost exclusively uh, uh, biomass, geothermal, solar, and whatever else. Mainly has to do with bullshit, right? You processing bullshit one way or the other, metaphorically or physically, to create electricity. And if you use their figures to calculate the results that they intend, that electricity is supposed to solve some of the problems of 0.5% of sub-Saharan Africa. So it's meant as an insult, number one. It's also meant to bring in lawyers and various kinds of crazed, 21st century so-called entrepreneurs into Africa to do nothing except to interfere and to give the United States a bad name. So if you go back to China, the question of China, how can the United States, and this is something that's obvious, I know it's obvious to Lighthizer and others, how can the United States gain influence in Africa relative to China? China has immense influence now because they're building critical infrastructure. Whatever is wrong with what they're doing, he recognizes, and the other people in the Trump support recognize that they are building that critical infrastructure, and the U.S. is not, and the West is not. So how would the U.S. regain influence? We used to have a lot of influence in Africa. No number of troops, covert operatives, or NGOs operating, sneaking around somewhere are going to, or CIA agents, that doesn't give you any real influence when somebody else is building things. You could reduce everything to a rubble field. That's true. But that is not influence. If we're going to regain influence in Africa, we will need to match China. Should we cooperate with China? I believe we should, but we have to match them in investment.
Yeah.
What kind of investment? Could this be private investment? Sure. I'm not that concerned about who does something like this when there are, hundreds of millions of people who don't have food and who are dying unnecessarily of various things. Solve the problems first.
Yeah. No, I agree. I agree. And I mean, I think that that's the type of competition which has a future built into it, and that like any viable form of capitalism, if it's going to be viable, it has to be premised upon what are you creating as far as new potentials for the future to be better than the present, and are you assisting nations that have been abused and colonialized to not just receive aid, which is, from what I can gather, at best what the US aid has been wired to do after JFK was murdered has been to, at best, give some fish occasionally just to like alleviate some of the pain, but overall withhold the means by which these countries would be able to stand on their own 2 feet and learn how to
That's right.
fish. So there's a very duplicitous intention behind this fake aid, also tied to appropriate technologies, like you alluded to, which Maurice Strong was doing with his role in Canadian foreign investments in the 60s, as well as his counterparts in the US, that we're all saying, okay, if we're going to, the new paradigm is going to be, if we're going to give a loan to a poor country, it's got to be with conditions that demand that the loan only go towards appropriate technologies, which are things that don't impact or change the lives of the people or the ecosystems. Like, if you've been burning dung, keep burning dung and we'll buy more dung for you to burn. But anything that involves a hydroelectric dam or something that really qualitatively improves you, that's not permissible. That we won't allow. So I think you're totally right. If the US is going to be able to properly win the hearts and minds of people, it has to do. That's why China's popular with many of the African and other poor countries of the world, because they're they're coming in saying, let's help you learn how to fish. Let's build you, like you said, critical infrastructure. So why can't the US take a lesson from that and do something similar and see who's best at alleviating the pain that people have been suffering under by helping them become sovereign? So yeah, totally. I agree once more. And this brings up the question that you alluded to, or you referenced very briefly, Middle East. And you mentioned a lot of people have been very critical of some of the extremely over the top messaging which Trump has put forth pertaining to his Gaza plan, emptying out the Gaza, turning it into a new casino like Riviera or something like that. But then again, it seems like there are, as belligerent and almost anti-constructive as some of these words are, it does seem like a conversation is happening amongst Arab states, and even Putin will be meeting, they say, with Trump in Saudi Arabia pretty soon. There's a seriously outside the box conversation that's being forced into this otherwise impossible dynamic that's been in place. So what's your take? Does Trump have, is there evidence in your mind that there is a much more reasonable, is this just like, yeah, is there a reasonable plan or method at play right now that a lot of people are not seeing, but that's observable?
All right, so put two facts together. First fact is that there was some kind of a ceasefire after these horrifying, month after month of mass murder by Israel, and simply terror all the time, bombing and rubble. So there's a ceasefire. The second fact is what you just said, that there seems to be a plan for a meeting in Saudi Arabia of Trump and Putin. We're bringing the Russians into the Middle East. That doesn't sound like the power politics of the great game. It sounds like a different kind of prospect. Have we solved problems? Not necessarily, but let me go back a little bit of history. In my book that's about to come out, as well as in the first volume, the second volume of Who We Are is hopefully now within a few weeks. I'll have a PDF available for people very soon and a cover that they can see. But in this book, I talk about two essential aspects of the nationalist side of this, the fight that went on in U.S. history between the economic nationalists on one side and the pro-imperialists on the other, protectionists versus free trade. And two aspects of this were that the nationalists were more for racial justice than the anti-nationalists. Of course, that applies to the Southerners and the Confederacy, right? They were the anti-nationalists, and they wanted to hold on to racial oppression. But that also applied to Boston, the Anglo-Boston axis against the nationalists like Thaddeus Stevens and others from Philadelphia who were for black rights. So that's one thing. In other words, the people who were for racial justice were the nationalists, what would be identified now as conservatives. They're for national sovereignty, which includes changing the South to make it industrial. So you blow away especially after abolishing slavery, you change it to blow away the old plantation system. No sharecropping, get industry in there, get modern times. So the other side were the racists, including in Boston, former abolitionists. Then the second part of this is that the people who built the nation, who had this pro-industrial policy, like Lincoln and his allies, were the ones who were respectful to other nations. Particularly, you can keep in mind China and Mexico. Lincoln famously fought against the Mexican War when he was a congressman. He thought that was unjust. It was U.S. U.S. acting like the British Empire. We don't want to do that. This is an unjust war. But he also sent an ambassador to China to regain mutual respect, which the previous slave owner governments in our country had tried to glom onto the British policy towards China with the Opium Wars and send ambassadors there which were disrespectful and said, "Will America has the right to walk all over you." Lincoln said, "No, we want mutual respect." They had the Burlingame Treaty that followed after Lincoln was killed, but that was his doing. So this is something to look back on. And when you think about Gaza, one aspect of the recent policy of supplying the bombs, USA and Britain supply the weapons to murder the Palestinians, and Republicans with a lot of, Israel lobby activation are the ones who endorse Israel to do anything, and Greater Israel idea, right? And so there's no respect for Palestinians. Recently, according to U.S. policy, and particularly the Republican Party, Palestinians didn't exist, like Netanyahu's emphasizes, and he's trying to make good on that by murdering all of them. So how do we view them in a better light? If the United States were to confront its past as a doer of good for its own people, and how we got away from that in former times as well as now to do evil. The United States has committed crimes against a large part of its own residents as well as other countries. And most presidents of the United States have been no good and have not conformed to the ideals of the country. The small number of leaders, presidents and others, who did live up to or pursue the ideals of the American Revolution perform miracles on a world stage and have had a profound effect. But unless you recognize this deep shifting of our course as a nation between the anti-imperial and pro-human ideals of our founders, our best founders, versus the shifts that we did under the influence of slave owners, under the influence of Wall Street, under the influence of a bunch of Nazis that supported Hitler and so forth, and have the same people deindustrialized the country. These are really, when you look at what they've done to the world, they are Nazis. So we did bad things as a nation. We did bad things to the Indians. We continued slavery for decades and decades, and which had since 1619 had been the policy of the British Empire. Finally, we got rid of it. We could have gotten rid of it with an industrial policy if that had been followed from the founding of the Republic. But so today, or in recent times, we have been continuing that morally reprehensible criminal outlook of our worst times. Unless you can recognize the difference between what we did good and what we did bad, you can't have a real conversation. So what's interesting about this problem is that industrial policy is at the center of this discussion about moral good and evil. Because, and that's the whole sort of hypothesis in my book, It's ramified in different ways in the different chapters and volumes. But the setting for the American Revolution was that England was industrializing at that very time and was gaining powers, and their worst leaders decided, their imperial leaders said, we're not going to let any other country industrialize. We have this power now. Ha! We have steam power, we have metal power. And so that was the setting for America's revolution. So the whole idea of improvement from our founders has to do with industrial policy. It's implicitly and profoundly an anti-imperial policy. And of course, imperialism, which is the same thing as xenophobia, isn't it? You hate other countries if you're an empire. Do nationalists hate other countries? Not in our history, not real nationalists, people who went out west simply to spread slavery and kill Indians. Can you call them nationalists? No, they hated the federal government. Yeah. They hated industry. They wanted to have, free trade. And they wanted to set up an empire in Mexico and Cuba. So that's the real background of nationalism. Nationalism is respect for humanity insofar as it is improvement of ourselves. And then when we improve ourselves, we see the same need in others. And that's how we get strong, by having that kind of relationship to the rest of the world. That's how we have influence.
Right. Yeah, and I guess that's sort of the popular, albeit wrong, notion of imperialism that has been promoted amongst a lot of the Frankfurt School revisionism that's tainted so many generations of Western education, is that imperialism is the necessary, almost deterministic consequence of nationalism. Or, in Lenin's, I guess, version of it, it's that imperialism is the necessary consequence of any form of capitalism. And perhaps, yes, if you define capitalism purely from its most perverse, dishonest, feudal expression of the British East India Company, yeah. Or if you define nationalism the way you just did, as like this slave-owning bigotry that wants to expand to subdue the weak for an alpha class, okay, sure. But there's an oversimplification in that the authentic traditions of nationalism are directly what you just referenced, which a lot of people, they lose that nuance, and thus they lose their ability to discern how to just navigate. The way I think about some of what's going on, I guess a good lesson was my studies of history of Canada, because I know a lot of Canadians are very confused about the term nationalism that's been given to them by the British Empire. And there's good aspects to it too, like but there's a fallacy also there that people are often too weak to properly evaluate, because it's very strong in our identity. But a lot of it was shaped by the John A. Macdonald, the national policy of the 19th century, which took on attributes of the Hamiltonian system. Like it definitely did. And there's protectionism. There was public works, the idea of developing critical infrastructure like rail, that was all there. But there's this weird quality about it because John A. Macdonald was putting this into motion on behalf of the empire that knew that they were going to lose Canada to the gravitational influence of the American system of Lincoln that was so strong. It was so strong. And if they didn't allow for a degree of growth to happen, Canada was definitely going to be lost to the empire as a chess piece in the great game. So they had to permit for the but once they unshackled creativity and allowed for that spirit of progress, even if the intention was dishonest, it still created a positive multi-generational transformation of the culture that began to recognize that our human nature is found, like our identities should be found in creating, in producing, in generating new discoveries and sharing it for the future. Like that awoke something which was very difficult to put back in the bottle or to pervert. Not that they didn't do a good job screwing it up, but it still took it was a risk for the empire to allow that, because you are awakening something Promethean. So whatever the motive is behind what's going on right now in the US, which I suspect has an element of what was done in the 19th century by the British Empire. Um, whatever, but whatever it is, it's definitely the effect is if you allow for protectionism with an intention to industrialize and to introduce new technologies to grow qualitatively, and you help other nations do the same thing as a foreign policy, then you will awaken something fundamentally human and anti-imperial in its essence, which can be worked. There's a lot more to work with that than the other thing, and the thing that cherishes just death cultism and scarcity as the new morality.
Yeah.
So yeah, I see that. I could see that.
So, I mean, if you in Canada's history, one of the uh, beautiful features of the Canadians was their welcoming of escaped slaves during the period of the preceding the American Civil War. So the Underground Railroad, many of the people would end up not just in the free North, but in Canada.
Yeah.
The irony of that, of course, is that uh, the people who solved the problem of slavery, chattel slavery, were the nationalists. They never solved the plight of the freed blacks because that was sold down the river by these liberals in Boston who said we want cheap cotton and we want free trade, but we want to keep the plantation system. But the nationalists from 1861, the Lincoln era, from 1861 to about 1879, these were the people who were for racial justice. These are the people that ended slavery, that guided the Union side. And so these are the people who were for American national interests. And so the irony is people in Canada who are, grieving about American nationalism, are they heirs of the people who had welcomed those escaped slaves? Because slavery was an imperial project, and we overthrew that project to a great extent by having industrial advance under national policy. So, and that's the same issue today, that all the people who have been the victims of robbery and murder in the world, which means every colonial people, including internal colonies, such as the Native Americans and African Americans, but also people in India and other countries. Everybody in the world has a deficit of national industrial progress right now. We have to reindustrialize the world. And I think that many concepts of that we've all grown up with, who were people born a little bit after me, but I'm 81 going on 82, but people that I know that are younger, even those who are who are now looking forward to reestablishing industry and don't like the woke agenda, nevertheless they're infected by an anti-industrial idea that's been given them, as for reasons that you said, from the Frankfurt School, from all kinds of channels of this empire. I think that will be very unpopular in the coming years as we industrialize, as we get back to industry. I think that if you're establishing, for example, a good relationship with Russia, or just a normal relationship with Russia, that automatically knocks down a good deal of this propaganda against industry because Russia has to have industry.
Yep.
Russia is an ally of China. Some of the people, including Robert Lighthizer, who say that China is our opponent, our adversary. Russia and China are working together. We have to counter them. He's only talking about trade, but that's a contradiction because Trump is working with Russia. Some people said he's working with Russia in order to attack China. I don't think so. I think that everything that he's doing, at least on the best side of what he's doing, is for normal times to come back. And that normal times has only been in effect for part of our history. And that means what's normal is progress. What's normal is peace. What's normal is no crisis. How long has it been since we've had a time of no crisis going on in the world? But you can't live under constant emergency and crisis.
Yeah.
So that's I think that we are going to, if we can reestablish this this historical fact of how we made progress, and I want to really promote my book to do this, and I'm hoping to write the third book now once this second book comes out. But so the third book is on the 20th century up to Kennedy. But we need a national conversation on this history with the industrial policy at the center of it. Industrialization as humanity's urgent need. That conversation has to proceed now.
Yeah.
And we have to address how that whole conversation has been suppressed and falsified in the past, and how the crimes of this whole era relate to crimes committed in the past by the U.S. and by our imperialist enemies. But let's have that conversation now. There's a great opportunity for it because I know that the people in this administration, and probably a lot of people hung around for decades who weren't even in this, the people are eager to get into a new policy. We have to have a conversation on the history of it.
Yeah. Well, definitely, I couldn't agree more that we have probably this is the last window of opportunity that will be presented to us if we don't take this opportunity to restore a healthy paradigm. We could easily face a very, very quick and painful slide into a prolonged dark age period for generations, which is unacceptable by anybody with half a brain who thinks this through. And I mean, I know I would put out a word of wariness because I'm a weary person, and I'm always I have trepidation.
Not weary.
Yeah. Wary,
not weary. You're not weary. You're very busy and energetic.
Oh. Okay. Well, I have concerns. I'm a busy person with concerns. And I do feel like there are some bad actors who do have what you alluded to, which is an agenda to try to pull Russia away from its commitment to partnership with China and back into a sphere of influence that would stab China in the back and break up the multipolar alliance. I know that there's certain people that see the same thing with India and would like to do certain things that involve India backstabbing its Eurasian partners by going for certain things that ultimately are not in India's interest or Russia's interest. I don't think that it's that. I think that those forces are delusional, and I don't think it's going to work. And I believe that Trump's orientation is to make deals, make business that would be beneficial for everybody, including all of the Eurasian Partnership members. So I do hope that that grouping succeeds and doesn't bust up in some way through whatever force or threats the multipolar alliance that offers us the best chance, I believe, of getting through this storm and recovering our sanity. So that's all in place. I very much appreciate your remarks. Now, as we round this out, maybe you could say a quick word. I'm curious myself. You mentioned your book is coming out, volume two of Who We Are, America's Struggle for Universal Progress. Volume two is coming out. Volume one ended a little bit before the Civil War.
That's right.
Volume two, you're saying, so what are you going to tackle in broad thumbnail sketch form in volume two coming out?
It's from the 1830s, starting with Lincoln's early career up through the 1890s. So really, it's the Lincoln era in American history, and I've dedicated the book to the memory of Abraham Lincoln and Henry C. Carey, who made us better.
That's
And I think there's going to be some excitement about the new light shed on how we actually changed from a more backward country into the world's leading power by a humane policy. It was never the cruel, vicious side of the Anglo-Saxons that actually accomplished the success. Even when you get into the Indians, the question of American Indians, there was plenty of room for everybody. We didn't really need to steal their land and break all the promises. That was a vicious policy that didn't help us. Same thing with our attitude towards China. When we put the Chinese Exclusion Act through, it was part of ruining the plight of our workers at the same time. And it was supposedly to help them stem the tide of bad immigrants coming in, take at lower wages. No,
mhm,
it didn't work that way.
mhm,
So when you break up the policy that led to our greatness, which is this industrial policy, which is for the development of other countries as well into powers. So there's a lot of history that people have never heard about, including the career of Thomas Edison, aspects of that which will be new to people. I just want to close with a concept about Gaza.
mhm.
Um, and I heard a very interesting insight from Jeff Steinberg a couple of days ago, and that was that Trump says, I'm going to solve this problem. I'm going to take ownership of this problem, not just own Gaza, but I'm going to solve this problem, me and America. What does that really mean? It means Israel isn't going to solve the problem. I'm going to solve it. And it reminded me of two things. First of all, I spoke of this earlier, that Alexander Hamilton, at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, proposed what was viewed as an extreme form of getting rid of states' rights altogether and just having a central government with all power. And people were aghast at that and said, well, wait a minute, why don't we just have a strong central government? And Hamilton agreed to that. So he's making an exaggerated proposal, knowing this would not go anywhere, but that it would call forth, the right kind of solutions. And I think that's what's involved with these outrageous ideas of sending everybody off out of Gaza. Of course, that's not going to happen. Nobody would accept that. Obviously, the other country, the Egypt and Saudi Arabia, are not going to take 2 million desperate revolutionary Palestinians into their country, right? So they are coming up with alternatives, and now Putin's going to be involved. So the other thing to mention along these lines, I'll just close with this, is that when President Franklin Roosevelt was at the conference in Iran, called Persia at the time, the Tehran conference during 43 or 44, during World War II, a meeting with Stalin and Churchill, he proposed using Iran's own resources, which mainly means their oil, for their own development.
Yeah.
He said it won't cost America's taxpayers a dime. Persia should use its own resources, and we can make Iran. We can help them with some technological or engineering help, but this will be they can develop and solve their extreme poverty and become a model for the development of poor countries into rich countries. So this was American intervention as an idea of development similar to what's needed now for the Middle East. That was the Middle East. And of course, when after FDR died, that didn't happen that way because the Truman administration was dominated by the British and by these vicious Anglo-Americans who, in the CIA and MI6, overthrew the democratic government of Iran, Mossadegh, in 1954, and stopped his nationalization of the oil, which had been our policy. That was U.S. policy that he was trying to carry out. And U.S. traders like Allen Dulles worked with the British to defend British Petroleum Company, which owned the oil in Iran. What gave them the right to control that? It was simply that Imperial Britain and Imperial Russia together at the big dawn of the 20th century had controlled Persia, and Britain controlled their resources and stole them. Our policy was to free them from that, our constant policy. So America's influence and America's legitimate policy is the development and progress of other countries, and that now applies to Gaza. There's plenty of obvious programs for developing Palestine and the rest of that region, which will be for the benefit of everybody in that region, including Jewish people. The problem with the Jewish people in that region right now is that the society in Israel is largely insane. And even though most of the people are secular in Israel, the component who are in one or another sect are allied to an underground of occultism, which you've written a lot about, going back throughout history, which is darkly anti-human and Armageddonist. And so this is insanity that rules Israeli society. And so if the rest of the world is involved in a rebuilding plan for the Palestinians, this will have a profound effect for Jewish people in the United States and elsewhere to confront this evil of occultist influences in the three Abrahamic religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The occultists who are stooges and have always been stooges of evil empires, and that's the problem. But we have to have this development policy to get anywhere near solving this problem.
Agreed. Yeah, I'd like to at some point maybe sit down with you. I mean, you yourself are Jewish. You've done more work on this as well than anybody that I know, to just flesh out a little bit more the psychology of political Zionism more broadly. If you're okay with that at some point, I'd love to schedule a chat with you. Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. And for those who want more Anton, not only can you get his books, volume one, number one is out right now. Volume two will be out soon. In the description box, there's the link. Substack, support Anton on Substack. I do. And I really recommend everybody follow Anton's material that comes out on a regular basis. Get the paid upgrade that gives Anton the jet fuel he needs to get this work out there. The last thing, February 23rd, Sunday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, Anton will be delivering the Rising Tide Foundation lecture for all paid subscribers to our Substack. Please take part. Send me an email, get a paid upgrade for my Substack and for the Rising Tide, and you'll be able to take part, ask Anton some questions. That's going to be open again February 22nd, Sunday, 2 p.m. Eastern time. So, Anton, I
George
think we start
Washington's
out.
birthday.
Huh? Who's birthday?
George Washington's birthday.
Oh, that's auspicious. Okay. Excellent. All right. So then there we go. 2 reasons to be there on Sunday, February 22nd for Anton Chaitkin. Anton, thank you for sharing your thoughts, your insights over the course of this hour, and I look forward to our future chats. Take
Thank
care.
you, Matt.